Good morning and welcome to the San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing for faith and community partners. Today's speakers will be addressing combating Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and ensuring security at mosques, synagogues, and their religious institutions. Thank you. The important and ongoing work of the San Francisco Interfaith Council would not be possible without generous funding from congregations, corporations, faith-based social service agencies, foundations, judicatories, and supporters like you. Help us spread the word. Visit sfinterfaithcouncil.org to learn about SFIC programming and how to become a supporter. Follow SFIC on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe to SFIC's YouTube channel to watch all of our virtual events. A bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being recorded. For audio and video, all participants are muted and without video to minimize distraction. For closed captions, select the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and click Enable Live Transcription. And at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trey. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this week's special online briefing for community and faith partners. As geopolitical tensions rise and counter-narratives become more inflamed and entrenched, never more than now has the value of long-cultivated and trusted relationships among interfaith partners been more critical in responding to local needs. This week's special San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefing for community and faith partners welcomes Islamic Networks Group founder and executive director, Maha Elgenaidi, and Jewish Community Relations Council CEO, Tyler Gregory, who will speak to the current challenges as well as resources available to combat Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and ensure security at their houses of worship and institutions in the region. As we do at the beginning of each of these briefings, allow me to read the following interfaith statement. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other, that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. This morning, to ground us in a reflective moment, we welcome Father Paul Fitzgerald, President of the University of San Francisco.
Good morning. My name is Paul Fitzgerald, President of the University of San Francisco, and it is my honor to offer these thoughts. I offer these reflections taken from the thoughts and words and actions of the patron of our city, Saint Francis of Assisi. On the 27th of October, 1989, Saint Pope John Paul II organized a great day of world prayer in the town of Assisi in Italy. Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and members of other great religious traditions were brought together to pray for world peace. Assisi was chosen because of its association with Francis, who is considered by many to be a great prophet of peace. His reputation for interreligious dialogue and engagement for peace springs from a voyage that he took in the year 1219 in the midst of a horrific war between Christian nations of Europe and Muslim nations of North Africa and the Middle East. Francis crossed the Mediterranean Ocean, and then he crossed lines of combat, seeking an audience with the Sultan of Egypt, His Highness Malek el-Kamil. After a few days of talks between the Sultan and Francis, Francis returned to the Crusader camp. They were astonished that he was alive and unharmed. He reported that this 2 days of dialogue had been so fruitful in terms of respect, encounter, engagement, listening, prayer. This nonviolent encounter in the middle of a violent war has become an inspiration for many people. St. Francis is considered to be a model for interreligious dialogue because he was someone who could put off violence and any threat of violence, and then encounter the religious other with respect and awe and curiosity and engagement, knowing, believing deep down that they both sought to meet the living God, God of peace and justice and beauty. This image of Francis is good, I think, for our conversation today. As we meet each other in interreligious dialogue, may we follow in the footsteps of St. Francis, who asked God to employ his poor, small, little humanity in the service of a great, beautiful, divine project, that humanity, created in God's image and likeness, may all be one. And so let us pray. Lord, make us an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Father Paul. The mission of the San Francisco Interfaith Council is to bring people of different faiths together, to celebrate our rich, diverse spiritual and religious traditions, to build understanding, and to serve our community. And it is in that spirit that we come together today to address issues of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and ensuring security in houses of worship. We welcome two experts in this field whose organizations and their missions are dedicated to similar visions and values. Maha Elgenaidi is the founder and executive director of the Islamic Networks Group, whose mission is to promote peace by fostering understanding of faith-based, racial, ethnic, and cultural communities through teaching, learning, and engaging across differences. Among their programs is the Interfaith Speakers Bureau, which consists of representatives of the 5 major world religions who speak together in front of live audiences on various topics from their own religious perspectives. One of those panels is the Jewish-Muslim panel on countering anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Maha is a graduate of Stanford University in religious studies and American University in Cairo in political science, as well as a Bay Area resident for the past 35 years. Tyler Gregory is the Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Community Relations Council. Ty joined the JCRC as its 5th executive leader in April of 2020. Under his leadership, JCRC pursues a just world where Jewish identity is embraced and all people can thrive. Previously, he served as executive director of A Wider Bridge, the LGBTQ+ organization advancing equality in Israel through international support and cooperation. During his 6 years with A Wider Bridge, the organization grew from a Bay Area startup to a national advocacy organization. Ty spent the early years of his career in the political department at American Israel Public Affairs Committee, educating candidates and partnering with members of Congress to strengthen the critical U.S.-Israel relationship. He is a resident of Oakland, a proud graduate of UC Davis, and a native of San Diego. We welcome you both. Maha, why don't you lead us off?
Thank you so much, Michael, for the invitation to be here. Good morning, Ty, and good morning, everyone. So because of the extreme polarization of views on the crisis between Palestinians and Israelis and their supporters, I want to begin by saying that while ING and JCRC have been in relationship for 30 years, starting when Oslo was first signed, we've only addressed issues that concern both our communities in the United States, such as Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. ING does not do political work, whereas part of the work of the JCRC is political and involves support for Israel. That has raised questions from my community about the appropriateness of this cooperation during a war that is clearly imbalanced with an organization that supports Israel and does not condemn its current actions. It is a legitimate question that I take to heart and take very seriously. The answer is that major concerns of both our organizations intersect. The communities that we represent face interrelated forms of bigotry, both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. My organization has written about how these bigotries intersect in white nationalism. Independently, since 2007, so it's been 15 years now, with our Muslim and Jewish speakers, we've conducted over 400 Muslim-Jewish panels that address these two faces of bigotry. And it was based on answering the question that I asked of whether American Muslims and American Jews have shared concerns outside of Palestine and Israel that we've released several statements condemning anti-Semitism, and JCRC has issued statements condemning Islamophobia. Today, both our communities are facing serious threats from hate crimes, harassment, discrimination, and more violence. We've all mourned the murder of a 6-year-old Palestinian boy by the name of Wadia al-Fayoumi. We've recorded a record number of attacks involving vehicles being used as weapons, targeting pro-Palestinian demonstrators. One just took place on the Stanford campus. Outside of a general agreement on a two-state solution, which may no longer be viable, which informally I've discussed with many of my Jewish colleagues, I think it's no surprise that Jewish and Muslim Americans often fall on opposite ends of the spectrum on Israel and its relationship with Palestinians. And I'll give you an example right now, which I'm sure is going to ruffle some feathers. According to various news sources, so far Israel's bombardments has killed over 10,000 Palestinians, mostly civilians, including 4,000 children. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been wounded, and at least 1.5 million are now displaced. Palestinians have run out of clean water, food, and medical equipment, and just this morning we learned that Israel plans to continue its physical presence in Gaza, which most of us are not surprised about. This is a settler expansionist government in Israel. So if we consider the Hamas attacks on October 7 as terrorism, then we must also condemn as state violence the scale of Israel's response against civilians, innocent women and children that have been living under siege and before that an occupation for decades. I have often raised the question of the wisdom and even morality of continuing to support Israel without condemning its actions against Palestinians. One of my board members lost over 50 family members in Gaza. There is not a Muslim American who isn't impacted by this war because we have Palestinian friends or family members. I think we all agree that the violence between Israelis and Palestinians clearly has to stop, and the effort to stop the violence begins with seeing Palestinians and Israelis as human beings deserving of life, peace, and dignity. And this is precisely what brings us to this conversation and why I do the work at ING. What is happening to Palestinians today in the United States is a textbook case study of Islamophobia and its close cousins of anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian sentiments. But it began with Islamophobia centuries ago under the Crusades, later reinforced under colonialism, which is a presentation by itself. According to scholars, Islamophobia is a form of racism because Muslims, while defined by a religion, have been racialized as non-white. So even if one is a white European Muslim, one's racial category becomes non-white as soon as one identifies as a Muslim. Therefore, Islamophobia can reasonably be considered as anti-Muslim racism. The tropes associated with this form of racism include the following. Islam is seen as a monolithic block, static, unresponsive to change. It's seen as separate and other, that it doesn't have values in common with other cultures, not affected by them. It's seen as inferior to the West and barbaric, primitive. It's seen as violent, aggressive, supportive of terrorism. And in the worst case, it's seen as a political ideology, not even a religion, that is used for political or military advantage. These tropes have been used to justify discriminatory practices towards Muslims and Arabs, so that this sort of hostility is seen as natural and normal. And this is being manifested now during the war between Israel and Hamas in three ways that I'm going to talk about: in policy, in media coverage, and in the perceptions of Palestinians who are often conflated with Muslims. On policy, the current war was immediately framed as an American war by President Biden. It was no longer simply a war that Israel was waging, but rather our war, as reflected in statements and messaging by President Biden, trips to Israel by White House officials, and military funding. And this policy was reinforced by the vast majority of Congresspeople and corporate leaders who made it clear that they support Israel's right to defend itself by any means necessary. Many of us who have followed this conflict have recognized that this stance reflects a long-standing US policy of support for Israel over Palestinians. But I don't think many Americans realized the scale of support, not only by our government, but also by major institutions such as corporations. Even school districts got pulled into this. This, of course, has had a horrific impact on Arabs and Muslims who are part of these institutions, who go to school, our college students who work for government, who work in government and business. Not only are they traumatized and left grieving by the violence they're seeing in the news and social media, mostly on Al Jazeera and social media, but they now also find themselves silenced, censured, or fired by anything they may say or do that is seen as even in the smallest degree as being pro-Palestinian. Islamophobia is also manifested in mainstream media coverage that has been one-sided, more focused on Israeli perspectives on the war than Palestinian ones. The widespread calls for a ceasefire have brought somewhat more attention recently to the situation of Palestinians in Gaza, but the concern shown, at least from official US channels, has to do not with ending the violence, but with helping in the displacement of Palestinians and deflecting criticism of the humanitarian disaster that Gaza has become. And even before this war, according to studies that have been done, this is a study that was done by 416 Labs, which is a research firm based in Canada. Mainstream media in like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others published 4 times as many Israel-centric headlines as Palestine-centric ones between June of 1967 and 2017. Additionally, Israeli sources were nearly 250% more likely to be quoted than Palestinian sources. And in Israeli-centric headlines, the use of the word occupation has declined by 85% since 1967. The use of the phrase Palestinian refugees in headlines has also declined by 93% over the 50-year period. Media coverage also shows selective focus. While it's perfectly appropriate to cover the Hamas attack, the victims and their families, and the war, there is very little coverage that is humanizing Palestinian victims or the ongoing violence they've endured for decades under siege and in occupation in both Gaza and the West Bank. So the American public is getting a very skewed picture of what's going on. Local or even Palestinian American voices are almost entirely absent from media coverage, or they're heavily edited if they veer from the approved narratives. And how often have we seen media coverage of pro-Palestinian protests or the scale of the protests around the country? Very little, if at all. They've been mostly covered on YouTube or on social media. Third, Islamophobia is also manifested in public perceptions of Palestinians who are often conflated with Muslims. A recent Pew summary of reports about American sentiments about Islam found that 2 out of every 5 Americans believe Islam encourages violence more than other faith. And 1 out of every 2 Americans believes Islam is not part of mainstream American society. According to a Gallup poll 2 years ago, 58% of US adults sympathize with the Israelis and 25% with the Palestinians. And what we're hearing and seeing in the news today since the crisis began is heartbreaking. There is no outpouring of sympathy or empathy for Palestinian civilians caught in the gunfire. We're hearing genocidal rhetoric by Republican leaders referring to Palestinians as savages who have to be eradicated, and calls to level the place, referring to Gaza with its 2 million mostly civilian residents. And no one is speaking out, or not as much as they should, against references to Palestinians as human animals, call to turn Gaza into a deserted island, a city of tents, expectations of moving 1 million Palestinians to the south of an already overpopulated Gaza, using starvation as a weapon, referring to dead children as collateral damage, or even questioning the number of dead after thousands have already died. I was watching Morning Joe this morning, and again, they did it. They're still questioning the numbers. It doesn't have to be this way. We can honor and mourn with Israeli civilians without simultaneously devaluing the lives, sufferings, and basic human rights of Palestinians. Now, the most recent impact of growing Islamophobia is hate crimes and incidences, social media account suspensions, harassment of Muslim students in schools and college campuses, and discrimination and terminations of Muslim employees and corporations. Since the Hamas attacks on October 7th, ADC, the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, and Palestine Legal reported 1,000 anti-Arab incidences. CARE reported 800 anti-Muslim incidences as of yesterday. And CARE believes that the number of complaints is the largest wave of complaints it has seen since Donald Trump's Muslim ban. CARE also points out that their numbers likely do not represent all cases nationwide. Why? Because those targeted by hate and discrimination are often afraid of reporting due to potential backlash. In one of their studies, CARE found that 85% of Muslims who have been a victim of a hate crime do not report it. So in closing and in review, Islamophobia is essentially anti-Muslim racism, which is being played out right now, these days, in how we've portrayed Palestinians in the media as both terrorists and victims, which only reflects our perceptions of them, which is related to our perceptions of Islam and Muslims, and in turn drive the policies we have towards them. Overcoming Islamophobia will partly happen through education and engagement, and that deserves its own seminar, but I'll be happy to answer questions about that, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Tyler.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Michael. Thank you, Maha, and it's so great to see so many friends on the call. It won't surprise you that my perspective is different than Maha's, but the two of us are united in that the war cannot come to the Bay Area. We've seen what happened, that awful attack on that 6-year-old Palestinian boy in Chicago. Many of you saw what happened yesterday, where a pro-Israel protester was killed on the street. This cannot come home. We can have passionate disagreements about what's happening in Israel and Palestine, but we cannot allow 2 highly at-risk, vulnerable communities from being attacked and facing the brunt of something happening on the other side of the world. Both of our communities stood behind Asian Pacific Islanders after the surge in anti-Asian hate stemming from a foreign crisis in the form of COVID. And now it's happening to both of our communities stemming from the Middle East. And we have to stand with each other and with the interfaith community to make sure that Jews and Muslims continue to feel safe here in the Bay Area and across our country. I'm going to share some of my own reflections on the past few weeks. And again, I speak for myself, and I don't claim to speak for anyone else. We are marking the Shloshim, the 30th day since the Hamas terrorist attacks of October 7th. In the Jewish tradition, we bury the deceased very quickly. And the Shloshim is when we return to the gravesite to say goodbye. This is a very difficult Shloshim for Israelis and Jews around the world connected to the victims, because there are still 243 hostages being held in tunnels underground in Gaza, being cared for by Hamas, a terrorist organization, not because of their humanity, but because they are tradable. So as people grieve, as there is agony, we are still living an international nightmare. And what I want to impress upon everybody is that this is not a 2.5-year timeline since the last Gaza-Israel war. This is not a 20-year timeline, 25 years, man, I'm aging myself, since the Oslo Accords. This is almost an 80-year timeline for us. This is the largest single attack on the Jewish people since the end of the Holocaust. And when people see the footage of what Hamas did to civilians, by the way, Arab Israelis and Bedouin Arab Israelis murdered as well, it reminds us of pogroms, of a time where Jews were not liberated, where we lived under Nazi Germany, where we lived under the Soviet Union, where we lived as second-class citizens as best throughout Jewish history. In sum, many of us in my generation and the generation right before and after me have been lulled into complacency that we have been living in a post-Jewish history moment. And the wake-up call for all of us on October 7th was that we are not living past Jewish history, that we now, our generations of Jews, are a part of Jewish history. I'm not going to get into more detail about the violence that happened on that day, but what I want to impress upon everybody is that this is evoking memories of the 6 million, not just the 1,400. And for 89% of Bay Area Jews who identify in some form with a Jewish state, and for more than 90% of Jews in our country who identify in some way as Zionists supporting Jewish self-determination, our safety has been removed. And so as we mourn the dead, as we yearn for the victims' returns, we also mourn what had to be done, which is to return our hostages and restore security for the people of Israel and Jews around the world. And that means ridding Hamas from rule in Gaza. I have friends that are Israelis that have been killed. I have friends that are Israelis that have been called up into this operation. I have friends that are Israeli in Gaza right now. And most of them have been vehemently protesting their government for the past 3 years, whose actions watering down Israeli democracy and whose actions supporting the settlement expansion in the West Bank and hurting Palestinians in the West Bank go everything against their values. And so what I'm asking is for empathy for what the Israeli people are going through and for what Jews around the world are experiencing, an international nightmare. No one that I know that has been impacted over there or here wants to hurt a single hair on a Palestinian civilian in Gaza. There is one laser-focused mission: return the hostages and remove a terrorist organization, because what Jews have learned throughout our 2,000-year history is that you cannot appease anti-Semites, you cannot appease fascism, and you cannot appease terrorism. We learned this with Hitler. We are learning this with Vladimir Putin, and we must remember that with Hamas. So I understand that there are those in this call that disagree with my point of view. I'm not asking for your agreement. I'm asking for your understanding. And as we see the global repercussions for the attacks against Jews around the world, we are wondering, as Jews from countless generations before us, if we are safe in this country. In the early 1940s, as a picture started to emerge from death camps in Nazi Germany. There was evidence. There was evidence of what was happening to Jews who were being rounded up, put on trains. And when Jews tried to get a meeting with President Roosevelt, he turned them away. And ever since then, we've been wondering, why didn't the US bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz? And thank God, our community has learned how to organize itself. And unfortunately, some are weaponizing that as Jews having too much control, which is an ancient political form of anti-Semitism that we're being seen used on college campuses, in high schools, in leftist and far-right politics, and it is putting the Jewish community in danger. Our political organization is to make sure the words "never again" remain true today, so that that train tracks moment is never going to happen again, and that the American community that we know will stand with the Jewish community and keep American Jews safe. Now, I want to be clear. I also have Palestinian friends. I've been texting them on WhatsApp, both here and in the West Bank, because I'm worried about their families. They are losing loved ones too. And it is important to remember the complexity of what's happening. You know, there are Israeli Americans, there are Palestinian Americans who are sending aid to one another. And there are volunteer sites in Tel Aviv and across the country where Arab Israelis are in the lines along with everybody else, packing humanitarian supplies and sending them out to victims. So I ask that we define ourselves by the best of us and not by the extremists. If you go back to the Oslo Accords, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was at a peace rally and was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli extremist who said that peace was not going to be an option. He refused to see the Palestinians as human beings. He refused to promote a two-state solution, and it started to derail the peace process. And what did we see soon after? An intifada, the second intifada, where buses and nightclubs and restaurants were being blown up and left the Israelis in fear. But most Israelis and most Palestinians want peace. There is only one way, a two-state solution. Jews and Palestinians are indigenous to the same piece of land, and the only way that we are going to live side by side is to restore Israeli security and to make sure that Palestinian dignity is possible. And until we find a way to do both, there won't be peace. And so it's important that even as we have these strong disagreements, we understand that the crisis is coming home for our two communities and that we have to see one another. We have to make sure that despite our differences, we are talking to one another. And ultimately, you don't make peace with people that you see eye to eye with, but you have to see each other's humanity. And so I look forward to this discussion with you, Michael, about what we can do for each other, because we as communities need to lead and support one another and keep each other safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ty, and thank you, Maha. Bringing this conversation home, I'm wondering, in the most general sense, if you can give us a gut as to how are your communities coping?
I can go first. They're in a state of grief, trauma, shock, all at once. Shock at Biden's response to Palestinian suffering, grief for the dead and suffering, and just trauma for the repeated assaults against Muslims around the world. Islamophobia is not just national, it's actually transnational, which again is a topic for another day. Muslims and Arabs are also organizing and walking in protests. They're lobbying government officials for a ceasefire. They're raising money for humanitarian aid. They're trying to comfort and hold space for Palestinians who have lost loved ones. Muslims are also dealing to the best of their ability with limited resources with hate incidences as a result of the media coverage of the war. However, what I want to say is that we are a religious community, after all. And so we find a lot of relief in prayer, in supplications to God, with the full understanding that justice always prevails, always. if not in this world, then most certainly in the hereafter.
Thank you. Ty?
Look, people are scared. I think that our clergy are scared, but we refuse to cower in fear. We're going to show up. We're going to lead Shabbat services. We're going to engage our community. We're going to go to vigils. We're going to engage the broader community, all with a sense of fear, but a sense of understanding that we cannot cower, we cannot stay home, and we refuse to lose our authenticity and our Jewish pride in this moment. I think that we are living a new reality that will be with us far beyond the end of this war. I know the same is true for the Muslim community. And we're trying to grapple with what that means. But as people worry about their safety, my message to our community and to other communities is we cannot give in to the psychological terror of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and we need to keep showing up. So that's really the message that I'm trying to share with our community.
You both touched on your own respective faith communities. What are you hearing from rabbis and imams, their challenges over the past month?
Well, for the Muslim community, for the Arab community, they're mostly consoling people who have lost loved ones in Gaza or feeling tremendous stress and anxiety due to the televised killings of children and bombings of residential buildings and the general dehumanization of Palestinians that they're watching. Mosques are also holding events for their congregants to learn more about their rights, say if the FBI is visiting them, which is happening, how to handle the media when they show up to their doors, how to handle workplace environments that have become really hostile, and try to silence pro-Palestinian voices and so forth, which is very constructive. So, as Ty said about what's happening within synagogues, inside synagogues, the same is happening. Muslims are not going to be silenced. Palestinians and Arabs are not going to be silenced. But at the same time, 10,000 civilians have been killed, including children. Some of our friends, mutual friends, have lost hundreds of family members in Gaza. And so we have to deal with that as well.
Tyler.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same, I would say the same exact thing. We're holding families that have lost loved ones. We're holding families connected to the hostages who are in incredible anguish and haven't slept in 30 days. We're praying for peace. We're praying for a time where we can continue walking on that path to a two-state solution to live side by side our Palestinian neighbors. And we're making sure that our communities continue to be resilient. We're meeting with police departments and law enforcement and helping to educate them when they're worried about crime and overdoses and potholes, why a Middle East conflict has a direct impact on the Jewish and Muslim communities, because, right, Ma, that might not be so evident for them. So we're trying to keep that top of mind for them as much as possible. And I do have to say that they've been incredible partners. SFPD, the district attorney's office, and other law enforcement agencies around the Bay Area that we work with have really, continued to show up for us and keep our community vigils and congregations safe. And we are deeply grateful for that.
What would you say to the greater public when they ask, what can we do to support Muslim and Jewish Americans, in particular here in the SF Bay Area?
Mm-hmm. You want to go first, Ty, or I keep going first?
I'm happy to. Look, I think one thing that a lot of allies, whether it's Muslim, Jewish allies, hopefully allies are both of our communities' allies, I think they're hesitant to talk to us because they feel like they don't know enough. I don't know enough about the Middle East. I don't know enough about the history. Like, this is the most complicated political conflict in the world right now. Like, I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. Like, so I haven't reached out because I don't want to make a mistake. And what we tell them is lead with empathy. You can ask us how we're doing. You can ask us what we need. You can ask us, how can I show up for you? And our response is, I'm not asking you to make a political statement. I'm asking you to show up at Shabbat services. Be in community with us. Grieve with us. Pray with us. You can be around us without having to take a political position that may be divisive for your constituency. Jews want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to know that the broader community around them understands that this is a moment of insecurity, and just seeing them and being in community is really ultimately what we are most looking for right now. So again, you do not have to go get a Middle East graduate degree at SF State or another university to be able to support our communities right now.
Yeah. On that last point, it actually helps to do that, not to get a degree, but to learn about the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, particularly after the 1967 war and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, because I think that the American public is getting a very skewed picture of what's happening without understanding the conditions of the Palestinians living under occupation in West Bank and Gaza for the number of decades that they've lived under. So I think that's incredibly important. Donating to charities, supporting the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, I think becomes really important as well. And as I just want to echo what Ty said about just understanding, in our case, understanding what Palestinians and most Arabs and Muslims are going through in terms of watching the war unfold on their television sets, Al Jazeera, which in mainstream media, it's mostly presenting one side of the conflict. Arabs and Muslims are out in the world, are feeling alone, they're feeling isolated because the people around them have no background on the conflict, so they don't know what's going on. So instead of showing empathy, care, compassion towards Arabs, the people around them might be actually expressing hostility, and we know that. So hold space for Arabs and Muslims. Ask them, as Ty also said about the Jewish community, ask them if they want to talk about the war, about what they're experiencing, and hold space for them.
Thank you. Drilling down a little bit, what are you hearing about the experiences of Muslim and Jewish students in schools, and how can we support them?
I can go ahead and start because this is sort of the work that I do day to day. There have actually been good and bad incidences, but mostly they have not been great. And it's something that I've actually been wanting to talk to the JCRC about. Our organization has come across the following. One case involved school administrators in a high school attempting to force Muslim students at a high school to sign a statement condemning Hamas. These kids weren't even Palestinians. We were able to intervene and get an apology and training for educators. Several cases have come across our desks involving Jewish student-held pro-Israel events. In one case with an IDF Arab Bedouin Muslim soldier who demonized Islam. In this case, we advise Muslim parents to, with the administrators and hold a counter event that is more balanced and inclusive of all sides. Other cases involved schools posting up pictures of the Israeli hostages, displays of the flag of Israel in a classroom, the issuing of imbalanced statements supporting Israel, all of which made Arab and Muslim students feeling unsafe, silenced. And in these cases, we advise parents to meet with the administration, get the flag removed, and to challenge the wisdom of their school statements or allowing the posting of pictures of hostages during a war. I mean, if we want to have these discussions in schools, they should be held in the classroom with both sides of the war represented and with protocols for the discussion. And then, of course, bullying of Muslim students continues by associating Muslim and Arab students with terrorism. And as a result, we're doing 2 bullying prevention training courses for Muslim youth in the coming weeks. The positive things that have happened, which I'm really excited about. In 2 cases, Muslim and Jewish students held joint panels to discuss the conflict. In one case, and it went really well, and in another to discuss increasing bigotry against both communities, which also went extremely well. We've also had a lot of requests for educational trainings on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and our Muslim and Jewish speakers have been working together to make sure that we do this effectively, focusing on the bigotry that both of our communities are experiencing. So I'm excited about the positive things that are happening, and we want to promote more of that.
Thanks, Maha. I think the story is parallel on our side of the equation. I would say that our high school and college kids are in crisis, and we've heard from many public school students and college students that they don't want to return to their school next semester, period. It's heartbreaking. They don't feel safe. They don't feel like they have the full support of the faculty and the administrations. And sometimes that's not even the administration's fault because there's protection of free speech. But there is a real sense of insecurity. There were some Gaza walkouts that have been organized in San Francisco and Berkeley Unified. We're dealing with a school where there were a bunch of students participating in one where they were banging on classroom doors, yelling, "Bring out your Jews." That reminds us of pre-Holocaust Germany. And so, and the administration is not taking it seriously, and it's deeply, deeply frightening. And so we don't want to pull our kids out of public schools. We want our kids to continue going to, the highest quality universities around the Bay Area, and we want to support administrations in doing the right thing on these issues. And I think neither slants is appropriate. People need to have a curriculum that is balanced and informative, and there shouldn't be activism by teachers in either direction in the classroom. And they need to be able to hold space for Jewish and Muslim students both. And yes, Maha, I think the more that we can have dialogue between those two communities, and for the brave, it's not easy, but there are brave Muslim and Jewish students that are trying to do that work, and to have administrations and organizations like ours helping them build space for that, I think is critical. But I am not overreacting when I say that our kids are in crisis in schools right now.
Mm-hmm. I didn't talk about what's happening to Muslim students on college campuses. There are other organizations that are working on that. And what Ty described about Jewish college students are exactly the same experiences that Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students have also experienced, to the degree that I actually suggested to our Muslim liaison in the White House, Mazen Basrawi, to connect with the Jewish White House liaison, or the liaison to the Jewish community, about the possibility of bringing national Arab and Jewish organizations together in a room for them to have this conversation, because they're both saying that it's them who are part of are the cause of the problem, so that we can address these issues. And I was really inspired by a letter that both Dr. Hatem Bazian at Berkeley signed with someone a professor who was, pro-Israel, signed, saying that we will not tolerate any hate or violence in the course of our protests on the current crisis. And I think it's something that we need to do at the national level. So. But our kids are also experiencing the same on college campuses. Mm-hmm.
What about Muslim and Jewish employees? How can they be supported?
Yeah, same problems. I mean, corporations, I think, were incredibly irresponsible in releasing the one-sided statements that they did. And I continue to challenge the wisdom of calls to condemn. You must condemn Hamas while ignoring the disproportionate response by Israel that has killed as many, as I've already mentioned this, and then the long history of occupation that has left Palestinians destitute in Gaza and the West Bank. These statements have also encouraged pro-Israel employees to post about Israeli perspectives on the conflict, which have made Muslim employees feeling incredibly marginalized, silenced, and unsafe, not knowing how to have the conversation to rebut these one-sided statements and viewpoints without getting fired or being charged with anti-Semitism. That's also another issue that they're confronting. It's like, am I being anti-Semitic if I say something that is pro-Palestine? So we're holding a listening session with the EEOC with Muslim employees, and we've been having meetings privately with Muslim employees. Now, the positive things that are happening are the same things that are happening on school campuses, which is requests for Muslim Jewish panels and corporations where we discuss Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and recent experiences with hate, and also discuss, how to overcome both of these things. So, but I think corporations have been incredibly irresponsible with their statements.
Tyler?
I guess we're looking at different companies, because I could say the polar opposite. And again, I think that the same thing is true. There is enough empathy to hold Muslim and Jewish employees right now. One-sided statements in either direction are entirely inappropriate and are alienating for employees. and it's unacceptable. And I think one thing that's been particularly frustrating from our vantage point is that a lot of Jewish employees have been turned down in getting their own affinity groups because Jews have been denied an identity outside of a religious identity. We are a religion, a people, a nation, an ethnic group, all of the above. And some companies are saying, no, you're a religious community, like you. We don't do that here. So you can have an African-American affinity group, a Latino affinity group, but you can't have a Jewish one, and they misunderstand what a Jew is, which is so ironic because it means that they haven't gone through DEI training involving Jewish identity, which JCRC provides. By the way, there should be opportunities to have religious affinity groups, but it is incredibly frustrating for us when Jews are put in a box where we don't belong. And anti-Semitism works in different ways than other forms of oppression. There's definitely overlap, as Maha mentioned earlier, but it also works in unique ways. I think anti-Semitism is unique in that we are attacked if we don't have any privilege or if we are perceived to have too much privilege. In both cases, we get dehumanized, and that is a consistent experience throughout Jewish history. And so many employers and HR departments don't include Muslim or Jewish inclusion in their DEI programs. And that's why it's so important that they, whether it's a university, a tech company, a school district, or city employees, that they include a robust DEI program for Muslim and Jewish identities into their broader curriculum.
Thank
And I
you.
think that's why Muslim and Jewish panels have been really successful. But that's, I mean, what you said is interesting to me about the statements, because I haven't seen pro-Palestinian statements. I've seen mostly pro-Israel statements, but it's interesting.
Prior to the pandemic, we saw a series of attacks on houses of worship, some very, very fatal and bloody. And I remember going to vigils following those attacks where our mayor would show up and say people should feel safe when they go to worship. And what sprung from that was our communities came together and we had a robust conversation and offered resources on security in houses of worship. With all that's going on now, what precautions are you recommending or taking for security in worship spaces, mosques, synagogues, schools, institutional buildings?
You want to go first, Ty?
Sure. I mentioned our coordination with law enforcement. We've been advocating heavily, as has the interfaith community, for the nonprofit security grant program. And we applauded Gavin Newsom for doubling the annual budget from $20 million to $40 million. And shout out to all of the clergy, including many that I know have applied for those security grants to help our houses of worship, in particular mosques and synagogues, but not exclusively. I think of a lot of API Christian and Buddhist houses of worship also that, urgently need this funding. That advocacy that JCRC and community organizations like SFIC have done, I think is critical, and we need to stay engaged with that. There's a budget deficit right now, but quite frankly, that number's got to continue to go up. So that's my call to action this morning. But there is increased security presence. Rabbi Jonathan Singer at Temple Emmanuel likes to talk about how you go right across the street and there's no security outside of that church. But if you go to Emmanuel, it's like you're entering a fortress out of necessity. And so that contrast is just kind of like a wake-up call for the state of affairs for the American Jewish community right now. And Maha, I'm sure you agree for your community. We want our houses of worship to have open doors and welcome all. Welcoming the stranger is part of our Jewish tradition. And what's happening is requiring, out of safety, for us to compromise some of those inherent values of who we are and what we think we represent. And that's frustrating. We don't like that. But that's where we are right now. And I know that there have been additional measures that Maha can talk about for both of our communities.
I wish that Muslim organizations were applying for that security grant money. I don't know if they are. It's something that I've been pushing for the last several years, that's exactly what we should be doing. And I'm hoping that more of them are. So yeah, it's something that I've certainly been pushing. But I did talk to a few mosque leaders about this, and some of the mosques have actually hired private security. The vast majority of them, at least the ones that I've talked to, have been in touch with their local police departments to provide security or make rounds during congregational prayers on Friday. One mosque leader told me that they opted not to have police presence because they felt that it would add to people's stress and anxiety if they saw the police and people felt unsafe in their own house of worship. So they opted not to have police presence and just have police make rounds. While the mosque leaders themselves manned the parking lot while prayers are happening. So they literally place their own bodies as shields to protect their community. And that really just made me break down. Like it's really remarkable. But yeah, those relationships exist with law enforcement, and I'm really happy about that because ING's done a lot of work around that.
Actually, that leads very transition-wise into the next question. Over the years, both of your organizations have been vital community resources to local, state, and federal law enforcement.
Yeah.
Has that long-term investment been helpful in responding to the current concerns over Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and security in houses of worship? And if so, how?
Yeah, so I'll go with that one first, Ty. Just by way of a background, my organization has been doing DEI work for law enforcement since 1995, and I've been on many commissions and organizations that worked with the community and law enforcement to address hate crimes. I was also very grateful to POST, which is the California Commission on Police Officers' Standards and Training, for accrediting our law enforcement trainings. And because of that, we've done a lot of training for almost every police department in the Bay Area, if you can imagine. But we're old. We've been around for 30 years. So, and we do a lot of work also with police academies. Part of our training has encouraged police departments to also reach out to mosques. And today I feel like I'm seeing the fruits of that training, because every mosque I'm familiar with has really good relations with its local police department. I often see chiefs of police, commanders in the mosque during congregational prayer, either speaking to the congregation or just doing public relations work with them, which I'm happy about because it's needed. On the federal side, that is still in development, but my organization, along with several other national Muslim founded organizations, are very active in that area. And so, the FBI, with the U.S. Attorney's Office, with the Department of Justice, and so forth. So that area is growing in the area of the work that I do, which is training. Mm-hmm.
I think. And Maha has done excellent work across the country around this. We do a lot of that training along with our partners at the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, who do a lot of police training and education. Again, anti-Semitism works differently than other forms of oppression. And so it's important for our police officers and law enforcement to understand that. We're also urging, district attorneys to implement hate crime enhancements for charges both against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, because we need to make sure that people are deterred wherever possible from committing hate crimes against our communities right now. And so sometimes there's a hesitancy to do that, but we think it's really important at this heightened time of tension that those are being seen and taken seriously in the way that our communities would expect. And we've had conversations with our DA here. We've had Attorney General Rob Bonta. We've had extensive conversations with about this. We need to make sure that there's a clear message that this is not okay. We met last week with the owner of Smitten's, which is an ice cream shop in the Mission, where all of the glass was destroyed. And because she's a Jewish shop owner who, by the way, has never said anything about Israel or other than having like Passover themed ice creams, has never demonstrated any political statements on anything. Her shop was destroyed, and there's a GoFundMe there if you'd like to donate to it. That's been very effective, but we want folks to understand what scapegoating looks like. And you don't have to have a connection to Israel or take any kind of position on it for that to be happening to members of our community. And so we're using unfortunate examples like that to educate law enforcement and DAs about what's happening right now.
We've come to the end of our time. One last question. What self-care measures are the two of you taking both for yourselves and for your staffs?
I wish I did a better job in that area. For my team, we now all work out of our homes since COVID. Or in the case of Zach Markwith, he actually works out of a shared office space. I encourage people to take as many breaks as they need and whole days off, but none of them do. I have not seen that happening. We're all working, in my case, I'm working 7 days a week, 10 hours, 10 to 12 hours a day. I think because we all feel a responsibility, watching what's happening to Palestinians, we all feel a responsibility to provide our services to Muslim parents and employees who call us. We're also very service oriented. We're all about serving institutions, serving schools, college campuses. We're doing entire courses for college campuses on Islamophobia, by the way. Serving corporations. We're getting a lot of requests for our Muslim Jewish panels, which is fantastic. But we're also having to prepare for that. Okay, what are we going to do if this question comes up? And how are we going to respond to this so that we can stay to our mission of talking about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So it's been crazy. But I go back to saying that for myself and others in my community, we are religious folks. We are religious and understand that this is all in God's hands. We are here for a period of time to do our part in building peace in our communities, and we're doing all we can with the limited resources we have. We are committed to peacemaking work, and we're going to continue doing that, God willing. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I have staff on the call, so I can't lie on this one about the self-care piece. But we're doing everything we can to support one another. I mean, time is the most precious resource right now, and I can't lie and tell people that, we can take days off right now. But we're trying to feed our people, which is always a Jewish priority. We are trying to, give them other types of care. We're having a masseuse come in on every Wednesday and give people 15-minute chair massages, the little things, just so the board, our board has been buying people breakfasts, in rotation to say thank you. Just little things all add up so that, our staff know that they are appreciated. And a good bottle of wine doesn't help after work. So, we're doing everything we can. It's rough, both Palestinians and Israelis are suffering unimaginably right now, and there's no denying that. But I wanted to end with a story. A few years ago, I had an opportunity with an organization called Encounter to spend 3 nights in the West Bank. And Encounter's mission is to take Jewish organization leaders to engage with the other, because we have all these chances to go to Israel, but we don't really have opportunities to engage with Palestinians. And there was an option one night to do a homestay, to stay with a Palestinian family when we were in Bethlehem. And, some of our group decided not to. They weren't comfortable. And I said, let's give it a shot. So I was with a Christian Palestinian family, and I used to be married, and they saw a wedding ring on my finger. And they asked me, I'm gay. They asked me, where's your wife? Why isn't she with us? And at first I said, oh, she had to stay home because I was afraid to come out. And then we went with the family to the grandparents' home, and we watched soccer, football with the extended family that we met. And then we came back to their home, and we set up a hookah, a shisha, and the mother started asking me again. And I said, well, actually, I'm married to a man. And I had the courage to come out to her, and she said, oh, me and my girlfriends are really curious about our hairdresser. Like, let me tell you about him and what I think. And it was like such a non-issue for her. And it was such a humanizing moment. And, it wasn't even about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was about, being gay, being this liberal gay Jew with a Christian Palestinian family. And so with all the suffering happening, I try to remember that experience. And I know from that experience that peace is possible, that most people just want to take care of their families. And that despite all the tragedies that are happening right now, we can and must get back to that work of peace building.
Absolutely. I think women can very much lead in that effort. Women with children and women who don't want to lose their husbands, who don't want to lose their children. I think that they need to absolutely play a bigger role in this peace effort. So thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, Ty.
Thank you both for being here, number one, for all that you've imparted, and for your work with the San Francisco Interfaith Council. We consider that a gift. This concludes today's program, and we encourage you all to stay tuned for future programming. And the recording link to this program and briefing will be sent to our 5,600 e-subscribers by day's end today. We encourage you to share it with your friends and networks. Thank you, and God bless you.